If you're studying an inspector course for the Edexcel GCSE English Literature, then you can expect 2 questions in the exam, a choice between 2. One will be a theme question, such as discuss the importance of responsibility in Priestley's and Inspector Calls, and the other will be a character question. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the character question because I've come up with an approach which I think is really very helpful in relation to this play in particular and how to write about character. So bear with me, and what I'm going to share with you is a structured approach to writing about character. It applies to every character in the play apart from Eva and the inspector, where you'll have to use a slightly different formula. But all the other characters, this approach applies, so try and remember it. Those of you familiar with my poetry videos will know that I'm a big fan of acronyms to aid memory, and here's one for Inspector Calls characters: orals. So if you think orals when you go into the exam room, maybe write it on the top of your page as an aid to memory, then that will give you a paragraph by paragraph structure to organise your thoughts on whichever character it is that you're writing about. So let me talk you through the letters of oral. O stands for opening scene, and by opening I really need you to consider the stage directions at the start of the play before a character actually utters a word, because you'll see there that Priestley is really specific about how he wants the character to be portrayed, and his instructions are given in the stage directions. So for example, Sybil Burling is described as rather cold, Sheila as very pleased with life. That's important, isn't it, when we consider how she is at the end of the play, not very pleased with life at all. She's a character who changes a lot, as we know. Eric is described as half shy, half assertive by Priestley in those stage directions, suggesting something of his confusion, difficulty handling the situation that he's in. Arthur is rather portentous, and so on. There's a very helpful description in those stage directions for each character, which you need to know and you need to comment on. In this example here, I'm writing about Sybil, but you could substitute any character and this statement or something like it would apply. Priestley does indeed describe the character initially through the stage direction, and then he works very hard to ensure that in the subsequent dialogue on the stage, that characteristic comes across. We make judgments as an audience about character based on how they behave on the stage, how they interact with others, what they say, what people say about them as well. It's interesting that Sybil says very little actually in this opening scene, which reinforces this idea that she is cold and distant and rather detached. She doesn't enter into general conversation. When she does, it's often with a reproach. So, for example, she doesn't like the idea of young people drinking. She also reproaches Arthur for sending his compliments to the cook, which suggests something of her snobbery. She doesn't think that Arthur should be interacting with the servants in that manner. So I'm not going to go through every single character because this would be a long and boring video if I did that. But what I'm recommending that you do is, in your revision notes, look at each one in relation to the opening scene, how Priestley describes them and how that description is borne out in the dialogue that follows. I won't talk you through these points, but here are a few key points to make about the character that you're exploring. Remember, you're opening your essay now with how Priestley presents this character in the opening scene. So, important points to make include the following. R is for responsibility. I bet you saw that one coming because it's Priestley's big message in the play, isn't it? That we are all responsible for each other, and we forget that at our peril. So each main character in the play, apart from the inspector, of course, is responsible in some way or other for Eva Smith's suicide. So you need to explore what it is they did that pushed her closer to that despairing act, and also whether they accepted responsibility for what they did, because that distinguishes the sympathetic characters, the ones that Priestley wants us to like, in other words, the younger generation, from the unsympathetic characters, from the ones that actually represent everything he really hates, those people who will not accept responsibility, who don't believe in social justice, and who just care about themselves, their small worlds, their families. Now, since this is a major theme, you could draw quotations from all over the play to exemplify it, but we're looking for a really structured approach here to this essay on character. So what I'd like you to do is think about the scene in which the character you're writing about is interrogated by Inspector Gould. Because Inspector Gould makes it very clear, he's very direct with each of them, that they are responsible. What you need to look at is how they respond to Inspector Gould's assertion. Do they resist it? Do they accept it? Do they feel remorse, guilt, or do they just get upset that they're being spoken to like this? I think you know the answers to those questions if you've studied the play at all. But what we need here is some key quotations from the relevant interrogation scene. So I'll give you a few of those now. The inspector is essentially Priestley in the play. What I mean by that is that everything the inspector says about social justice, about the plight of the poor, about inequality, about exploitation, these are Priestley's views being expressed by the inspector in this very political play. So it's interesting and very important to look at each character in relation to how they respond to these views as expressed by the inspector. What is their attitude towards the inspector? Sybil's attitude is disdainful, really, because this is her social inferior. And this man has had the audacity to interrupt her family gathering in a most unpleasant way, and she certainly isn't interested in anything at all that he has to say. So her attitude reveals her snobbery and her ignorance, because she's not interested in hearing the truth and doesn't want to be enlightened by the inspector. We know from the opening scene, and if you're writing about Arthur, I hope you will have touched on this already. We know from that opening scene that Arthur is very pleased with himself. He doesn't think he has anything to learn. He knows everything. He's started his own business. He's made a fortune. He's very influential in the Brumley community. He's been a magistrate. He now has aspirations to be knighted. Um, so he's a big player, and he's very aware of this and very full of a sense of his own importance, very pleased with himself, as Eric points out bitterly at the end of the play. His attitude towards the inspector is contemptuous, like his wife's. But he has to take the inspector seriously because the inspector is threatening him with a public scandal. So how does he respond to this? Well, by threatening the inspector with his connections, and as he gets more desperate, by attempting to bribe the inspector. He clearly doesn't sense that the inspector has a moral mission, that he won't be sidetracked by any of these low tactics. This is a picture of Eric, but I'll cover Sheila at the same time because really their attitude is the same. They both fully accept everything that the inspector has to say to them. They accept responsibility for their part in Eva's death. Their attitude towards Gould is respectful. What's interesting about them both is the way their attitude towards their parents changes because they can't stand to see the wall that their parents put up between themselves and the inspector. They try desperately hard to tear that down to make their parents accept what the inspector's saying, but of course it's to no avail. So there's an awful lot of conflict towards the end of the play, which you could explore in an essay, how the attitude of the younger generation changes. It's as if the scales have fallen from their eyes and they're seeing their parents for the first time and they really hate what they see. Sheila's attitude shows that she really understands that the inspector is on a moral mission. She knows that his purpose in being there that night is to make the family improve the way that they treat others. She understands that Gould has some sort of extraordinary power, that he understands everything, that he knows what's happened before he even asks his questions. She knows that there's no point lying to him, and she begs everybody just to be honest because she knows that they're going to make a fool of themselves if they try to evade the truth. L stands for last scene, and it's important to look at how the characters react to the twist in the plot. In fact, we have two twists, don't we? The first is the revelation that there is no Inspector Gould at the local constabulary. That's what Gerald discovers and reports back to the family. And the second revelation is that no dead girl arrived at the infirmary earlier that night. So Eva Smith, for a short time anyway, didn't even exist. So how do the characters react to this, and what does the reaction of each one reveal about them? Well, earlier in the play we saw that Gerald didn't fully accept responsibility for his part in Eva's death. He did at least show emotion. He was distressed. He had to go out. He had to leave the family and the celebration for a while, and Sheila gave him his ring back and all that sort of thing. So he wasn't unmoved by what he heard, but he didn't actually accept responsibility in the very clear way, an emphatic way that Eric and Sheila did. So the audience is watching him closely now to see whether he has in fact learned anything about responsibility, and he disappoints because he, along with Arthur and Sybil, now feel able to laugh at what they perceive to have been a hoax. Clearly, Gerald has actually learned nothing, and I suppose L also stands for learning in this acronym. He can forget his treatment of Eva, which was despicable, because it's not going to impact on him in any way, and that is very disappointing. Both Sheila and Eric have learnt what the inspector wanted them to learn about the importance of justice in society. So in the last act, when the other characters are thinking they can get away with it, Sheila and Eric really aren't. They still feel a sense of responsibility for Eva. Whether she died or not, it's irrelevant. They still understand that they behaved very badly. It's almost as if Sheila takes over from the inspector in trying to drum sort of understanding into her parents. She says things like, "You're just beginning to pretend all over again." She's desperately concerned that her parents don't just carry on as before, as if this evening hasn't happened. She says, "You're ready to go on in the same old way," and that infuriates her. "It frightens me, the way you talk," she says. It frightens me too, adds Eric. They both fully accept the importance of the inspector's message about equality, truth, social justice. And so we come to the S of orals, and one level S stands for summary. Do remember to sum up the main point at the end of your essay. What's the most important thing of all about this character? S could also and should also stand for social type, though, because each character in this play represents a section of society. This is, as I've said several times, a political play. So these characters are characters in their own right, but they also represent a section of the community, the 1912 community in which the play is set. So the play is about the class structure as it existed in 1912 when things were very hierarchical. The Labour Party was only just beginning to have an impact on political life in 1912, so workers' rights didn't really exist. Eva Smith represents workers in the play, and clearly she depended on the goodwill of Burling, and people generally, working class people, depended on the goodwill of their employers far more than they do today. They didn't have any basic rights. It was down to whether employers wanted to treat them properly, fairly, or not. In Burling's case, he clearly didn't want to treat his workers fairly at all because Eva was sacked for wanting the smallest of pay rises. Burling represents the businessman, the self-made businessman. He actually hasn't got the very high social status, the old family that his wife is part of, and he has a chip on his shoulder about that, actually. He feels that Gerald Croft, who's from an aristocratic family, possibly looks down on him, so there are sensitivities around that issue with Burling. It's one of the reasons he so desperately wants this knighthood. He's a social climber, he wants to get to the top. As a businessman, though, a right-wing exploiter of workers, he represents everything that Priestley despises. And Burling thinks that people with the inspector's views, people who talk about community and us all being mixed up in a beehive, he condemns those people as cranks. He thinks this is crazy, this idea of social responsibility. So Priestley is utterly rejecting everything that Burling stands for. His wife, Sybil, comes from an extremely privileged background, an upper-class background. She's from an old family. She has an innate sense of superiority, which is why she's not interested in Inspector Gould, who's kind of classless, really. Again, she epitomises something that Priestley hates about English society, which is the class system. She sits at the top of that system. She's from an old aristocratic family, and coming with that is all sorts of privilege and social advantage. What Priestley is showing in the play is that superior social status does not make you a superior human being. We've already seen that Gerald has a superior social status to the other young characters in the play, to Sheila and Eric, because he's also from this aristocratic background. The Croft business is also huge, which is why Burling is very excited about the idea of this marriage. It's going to expand his business. And yet, despite this immense wealth and this position at the top of the social pile, Gerald behaves badly. His treatment of Eva is deplorable, and at the end of the play, he's not willing to learn from that. So it seems, actually, in this play, that the higher up the social ladder you climb, the lower your moral values are. Power, wealth, influence, social status, these things don't make you a good person, Priestley's saying. In fact, they're very much more likely to make you the opposite. So that's orals. I think it's quite a helpful way of thinking about the characters in Inspector Calls. And if I was preparing for this exam, I would make notes under each letter of that acronym for each character, because they're all interesting in terms of the way they are presented in the opening scene, the way they respond to their interrogation, whether they accept responsibility or not, their attitude towards the inspector, the last scene and how they respond to the twist in the plot, and finally the social type that they represent. That's, I think, a helpful way of looking at the main characters in this play.